Wittgenstein, prior to the traumatic political events of the Second World War, had left Vienna to study philosophy at Cambridge University, and within a relatively short period of time produced a work entitled Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1922, which claimed that it was the final solution of the problems of philosophy. Wittgenstein himself, of course, was forced to retract this claim when he was preparing another work, Philosophical Investigations, that would not be published in his lifetime, a work which, moreover, would contribute to mitigating some of the negative developments of modern philosophy, to which he contributed, that in their turn were neutralizing the arguments of Aristotle and Kant. In his final solution from his earlier work, it is stated that the world is the totality of facts, not things like a banyan tree. Language pictures facts, and the soul is essentially represented in this work as a linguistic solipsistic soul. The later work abandoned these positions in favor of the activity of language being embedded in Aristotelian forms of life, and the meaning of language was characterized as its use in various language games. The solipsistic self was abandoned for a soul embedded in a life world that was essentially public and communal. Yet it was the early work which most reflected the spirit of the times, and Campbell notes how such a spirit affected the interpretation of important religious texts. We take the Old Testament God to be a fact, not a symbol. The Holy Land is a specific place and no other. Man is superior to the beasts, and nature has fallen. With the fall in the Garden of Eden, nature becomes a corrupt force, so we do not give ourselves to nature. What do we read? We read newspapers concerned with murders, rapes, politicians and athletes, and that's about it. This is the reading that people use to devote to worship, to legends, of deities who represent the founding figures of their lives and religion. People today are hunting around for what they have lost. Some know they are hunting. The ones who don't are having a really hard time. Pages 19 to 20. Viewing the Bible as a totality of historical facts displaces the true locus of mythological and religious texts, which is, according to Paul Ricoeur. For us moderns, a myth is only a myth because we can no longer connect that time with the time of history as we write it, employing the critical method, nor can we connect mythical places with our geographical space. This is why the myth can no longer be an explanation. To exclude its etiological intention is the theme of all necessary demythologization. But in losing its explanatory pretensions, the myth reveals its exploratory significance and its contribution to understanding, which we shall later call its symbolic function. That is to say, its power of discovering and revealing the bond between man and what he considers sacred. Symbolism of evil. Page 5. Evil is a critical idea in the realm of the sacred. It is, Ricoeur claims, the critical point of our bond to the realm of the sacred. It involves the threat of the dissolution of the bond between man and the sacred, and makes us most intensely aware of man's dependence on the powers of the sacred. Therefore, the myth of crisis is at the same time the myth of totality. In recounting how these things began and how they will end, the myth places the experience of man in a whole which thus receives orientation and meaning from the narration. Thus, an understanding of human reality as a whole operates through the myth by means of a reminiscence and an expectation. Symbolism of evil. Page 6. So, our newspapers are filled with atomic facts which we read in a curious frame of mind that does not resemble the way in which we traditionally read our sacred texts. We no longer refer what we read to these holistic humanistic concerns with, for example, man's capacity for evil, his capacity to bring down ruin and destruction upon himself and everyone around him. Sin was a universal idea of reason that evoked expectations that man shall be worthy of the life he possesses. This moral dimension disappears when the emphasis upon the symbolic nature of man's existence is replaced by a myriad of different economic and political concerns. Of course, if one tires of economical and political news, there is always the latest news about our sporting or entertainment heroes, who always seem to be getting themselves into trouble, at least insofar as news reporting is concerned. It does rather appear as if concern with the news has become what Freud would call a substitute satisfaction, especially when we no longer desire to reminisce or concern ourselves with eudaimonia, leading a good-spirited, flourishing life. Modern man does not appear to be aware that he has lost something, and the question is whether we have regressed in relation to Campbell's observation that we all appear to be hunting for something. Campbell provides us, however, with a pedagogical item of news, namely the return of the Apollo mission, where we all witnessed on our television screens the first men walking on the moon. Returning to Earth from the mission, the crew received a question from Mission Control asking who was navigating the craft. The surprising answer given by one of the astronauts was Newton. Here were a group of scientists/engineers, for whom trust in the laws of nature was absolute and unquestionable, and for whom the world was so much more than a totality of facts. It is clear from this example that the actual practice of science involves trust in the metaphysics of nature. Campbell's response to this was the following. I immediately thought of Kant's Transcendental Aesthetic, the first section of his Critique of Pure Reason, where he says that time and space are forms of sensibility and that they are essential to our mode of experience. We can experience anything outside of them. They are a priori forms. So it seems we know the laws of space before we get there. In his Introduction to Metaphysics, Kant asks, how is it that we can be certain that mathematical calculations made in this space here would work in that space there? The answer came to me from these men. There is only one space because there is only one mind at work here. Enough was known of the laws of space to know just what energy should be put out of the rockets and what angle to bring the spaceship down within a mile of the boat waiting for them in the Pacific Ocean. The knowledge of space is the knowledge of our lives. We were born from space. It was from space that the Big Bang came that sent forth galaxies, and out of galaxies, solar systems. The planet we are on is one little pebble on one of these things, and we have grown out of the earth of this pebble. This is the fantastic mythology that's waiting for someone to write poems about. Pages 19 to 20. These astronauts also manifested the reverse of what the ancients felt looking out into space, when they looked back at the awe-inspiring view of the earth from the heavens. Kant, in his writings about the mathematical sublime, pointed out that experiences involving vast magnitudes, such as that of outer space, quicken in us a feeling of the sublimity of the experience. Part of this experience is the realization that the experiencer possesses powers that are appropriate to respond to this magnitude. Kant takes this experience of nature and uses it in an example to demonstrate the role of experience in the metaphysics of morals. Karazin's dream is a dream of a man who had throughout his life been using the people around him for his own ends. He dreams one night of a judgment on his life and a punishment of speeding out into the vast dark infinity of space, far away from even the light of solar systems. He awakens in a state of despair and resolves never to abuse his fellow man again. Karazin felt the consequences of a life of evil. This vice of acquisitiveness has, of course, existed throughout the ages in different forms, but up until modern times it has been seen to be what it is, namely a vice or evil that is detrimental for the character of man, which according to Aristotle and Kant, by nature, strives for the good. Hannah Arendt's perceptive analysis of the banality of evil was proposed even in relation to the Nazis that decimated the Jews of Europe. They were not capable, she argued, of thinking, which on her account of the importance of human thought, for bringing about the good was a significant criticism, much more significant than the emotional reactions to this deed that insisted on calling the Nazis monsters. The Karazin of her time was probably Cecil Rhodes, who upon perusing the planets did not experience the awe and wonder of the ancients, but a far more modern response of wondering whether they could be colonized, presumably for profit. She characterized him and a number of others beginning with Descartes as the new men, men who no longer thought as men once did, but for whom anything was possible if you could persuade the masses that it was. Many, a significant minority, of these masses of course knew that even with our modern technological resources, nothing of significance was possible any longer. During these modern times, the call has gone out several times from intellectuals for a Newton of the moral universe, but no candidate has been found apparently, in spite of the obvious cultural presences of Aristotle and Kant. What have we done to ourselves, if the above claims are true? Many things, But one important thing is that we have objectified ourselves into a hypothetical totality of facts without any relation to the sacred, the good, the beautiful, and the sublime. Hume was the leader of a movement which claimed that one cannot find a self in our perceptions, even if the self is a bundle of perceptions. Kant, of course, combated such a view in his critical philosophy, but his views were very quickly turned upside down by Hegel, and the self of modern psychology in the 1900s moved from being a science of sensations, feelings, and consciousness to being a science of observable, measurable behavior. In this process, all the intellectual powers of the self or the soul fell away, until we find the lonely logical solipsist of Wittgenstein's Tractatus, proclaiming that the world is a totality of facts, and the self is a subject about which nothing can be said. Of course, waiting in the wings of the universities, there were followers of Aristotle and Kant and the later Wittgenstein, trying to restore something of the ancient spirit of Greece and the more recent spirit of the Enlightenment. Ideas of the good will and the importance of the proclamation, "Know thyself," continued to be significant for these scholars working in the shadow of a modernist flow of ideas that disregarded the importance of historical approaches. This flow of ideas included regarding religion either as anathema, or in terms of the fantasy-laden idea of a day of judgment in the afterlife up in the heavens or down in the fires of hell. This belief in the afterlife had no real connection to experience. We pointed earlier to Campbell's failure to take into account Kant's ideas from the third critique, the critique of judgment. In this work we encounter explanations of, and justifications for, the idea of God as well as descriptions/explanations of the idea of the sublime, which Campbell refers to in the following way. This is what is known as the sublime, the experience either of space or of energy that is so prodigious that the individual simply diminishes out of sight. I have talked with people who were in some of the German cities during the British and American saturation bombings in World War II, and they told me it was a sublime experience. So there is more than beauty in the world. There is the sublime. The mythology coming to us from space is sublime. Kant, in his third critique, the critique of aesthetic judgment, discusses two kinds of sublimity, the mathematically sublime and the dynamically sublime. In both cases, the phenomenon that causes the response defies our power of imagination, and the faculty of reason steps in either with the idea of infinity or the idea of moral agency. In the case of space that Campbell refers to above, it is clearly the idea of infinity that reason is using, but the case of the Germans who had been bombed is less clear, and might involve the idea of freedom and moral agency. The citizens, that is, take solace in the fact that they are not succumbing to the ruin and destruction wrought upon them from mechanical machines in the air. In both cases, the Aristotelian faculty of nous is involved in appealing to the idea of infinity, or the power of causing oneself to act freely in an expression of moral agency. In terms of the Upanishad idea of "thou art that," both ideas of infinity and freedom may be involved. We in the West are obviously more familiar with the origins of our civilization and those of the Near East than we are with the origins of civilizations in the Far East, e.g. India and China. Campbell is attempting to increase our familiarity with the mythology of these distant cultures. In his discussion of Hinduism, he notes, "The earth is the energy of which some god is the personification, and of which matter is a concretization, and these things exist in eons and eons of time." Myths of Light, page 21. He then tells us a story about the hubris of the god Indira and the intervention of Brahma, who has the task of humbling Indira's pretensions. Indira is informed, for example, that he is only one of a multitude that came before him, and will come after him, and all of them will descend into the life forms of ants at some point in the future. These texts that use the idea of the infinite come to us from circa 400 AD, during the period of the decline of the Roman Empire. During this period, both Plato's and Aristotle's ideas were still influential through the teachings of philosophical schools and academies, which would, just over a century later, be closed by the Emperor Justinian. The translations of Plato's works were, however, more widely available than those of Aristotle's, many of which were lost. Campbell argues that civilizations in the West and Near East were more susceptible to invasion than those in the East, which were more naturally protected by their geographical locations. The northern nomadic Aryans, from the north, and the Semites from the Middle Eastern desert, continually caused many settlements considerable difficulty, forcing them to adapt to radical changes in their lives. The first organized settlements arose in the Near East around 800 BC, with higher forms of culture emerging around 2500 BC in India and 1600 BC in China. Nomadic hunting and foraging were replaced by agriculture and animal husbandry. Around 4000 BC, the first city-states emerged in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. Campbell points out that these city-states developed a division of labor based on a principle of specialization, e.g. politicians, priests, merchants, and farmers. He does not mention teachers, which is curious given the obvious importance of knowledge in the transmission of ideas in the society. Around 3500 BC, we see the emergence of writing, mathematical calculation, astronomical observation, and tax collection arising as a result of the principle of specialization. Village agricultural communities emerged somewhat later in ancient Greece, ca. 700 BC. Settlers from the Near East probably brought the necessary skills and knowledge to form these communities. As a consequence, organized city-states emerged somewhat later in ancient Greece. The first city-state was probably Eclana, ca. 1600 to 1100 BC. Persian city-states, in contrast to those in ancient Greece, were autocratic, and it was not long before rulers began to desire larger territories. Athens and Sparta soon became targets. The Athens of the 5th century BC was a city-state with a complex system of law that had recently humanized an earlier draconian system of law by, for example, redressing injustices between the rich and the poor. Campbell argues that the mythology of the above system of city-states, as well as those of the Far East, possessed the structures they did, owing to being expressions of archetypal patterns of the human mind. These archetypal patterns were both models of the cosmos and the human mind. Archaeology, for example, has revealed that many civilized settlements had a mandala circular structure, in which the god/king/ruler was centrally placed in the settlement, with his servants all around him. Campbell notes the calm acceptance of Far East peoples of the world the way it is, resting calm in the daily presence of their religions. They do not need to anthropomorphize the powers of nature, because their primary concern is not to harness these powers, but rather see them as divine conditions for human existence. For them, whatever is transcendental lies beyond the scope of human thought, and there is, therefore, no attempt to understand God, because only God can know God. For the Eastern mind, God is the infinite, both without and within man, an infinite that has no name. Campbell contributes the following problematic reflection. In Occidental theology, the word transcendent is used to mean outside of the world. In the East, it means outside of thought. To imagine that your definitions of God have anything to do with that ultimate mystery is a form of sheer idolatry from this standpoint. Page 33. Aristotle's God is not defined, but portrayed as a special form of thinking which is completely different from human forms of thinking, which is thinking about the world. On this account, God is neither outside the world, nor outside of thought. God as a prime mover is sometimes characterized in empirical thought as a force or power, which imparts movement or motion to the world. On Aristotle's account, however, God is a prime form, which is more akin to a first principle. This does not put Aristotle's God outside the world, because for him forms are inside entities located in this world, and not, as was the case with Plato's forms, something spiritual and beyond the reaches of the physical world. Whilst, on such an account, God's thinking is beyond our range of thinking, God's thought about himself is nevertheless not transcendent. Campbell's formulation above is therefore awkward. Similarly, for Kant, the transcendental X means something more akin to a first principle than anything more concrete or more spiritual. Indeed, the relation of what Kant refers to as the noumenal world of things in themselves has a far more complex relation to our phenomenal world of experience. It is, for example, that which we can think, and therefore cannot be outside or beyond our thought, but it is beyond our knowledge because it is beyond our experience or sensible intuition. God is therefore an idea of pure reason, a pure thought. Theology, being a systematic study of God, whether he be idea or existence, contrasts itself with mythology, which relies on the narrative forms of allegory and parable to communicate the meaning of its religion to us. For us in the West, there does not seem to be any reason to deny Aristotle's or Kant's thoughts on religion, the status of theology. Indeed, the clouds of mythology appear to condense into the drop of one question: can the relation of the world of man to his gods be the same as the relation of principle to the world and thought of man? The mythological proclamation of "Thou art that" appears to raise other types of question relating to the principle of Sush and its relation to first principles. Campbell claims, "You yourself are that which you would know," page 34. This rings true insofar as it harkens back to the oracle of ancient Greek, and the challenge thrown down to us to know thyself. Whilst we cannot have knowledge of the noumenal world in which God dwells, we can nevertheless, according to Kant, think about God, without being able to think like him. For Kant, this kind of human thinking is not conceptual because, given the fact that God is not in space and time, we cannot have any intuition of something that has the characteristic of being omnipresent in the past, present, future. No intuition of what is eternally present is possible. Man may well be made in God's image, but what it is that brings us closer to God is the relation of God, the first principle, to man's cognitive powers, noos for Aristotle, or pure practical reason for Kant. In the third critique, Kant maintains that we are wholly unable to cognize a priori whatsoever the ends of nature in the physical order, and above all it is impossible to see that a nature could not exist apart from such ends. Critique of Teleological Judgment, page 112. Kant elaborates further upon this point. While fear in the first instance may have been able to produce gods, that is demons, it is only reason by its moral principle which has been able to produce the conception of God. Page 112. Kant has been arguing throughout his work that the theoretical proofs for the existence of God fail, and the only satisfactory proof we have for the existence of this first principle is a moral proof. Insofar as we can never have a conception of a nexus finalis in physical nature, we cannot definitely attribute any worth to, for example, a speck of dust floating in a shaft of light, a range of mountains, a waterfall, etc. Worth begins in the realm of thought and cognitive powers, which only human Sush is capable of. The categorical imperative, then, is a principle which urges us to treat all men as ends in themselves, which implies not using them instrumentally without their consent for our own narcissistic purposes. Whilst it is not the first principle for Kant, it is connected to that first principle which Kant describes as the moral author of our world, situating it squarely in the holy space of the sacred. Kant relates this moral argument for the existence of God to religion and theology. The fact that in respect of all our ideas of the supersensible, reason is restricted to the conditions of its practical employment is of obvious use in connection with the idea of God. It prevents theology from losing itself in the clouds of theosophy, i.e. in transcendent conceptions that confuse reason, or from sinking into the depths of demonology, i.e. an anthropomorphic mode of representing the Supreme Being. Also, it keeps religion from falling into theurgy, which is a fanatical delusion that a feeling can be communicated to us from other supersensible beings, and that we in turn can exert an influence on them, or into idolatry, which is a superstitious delusion that one make oneself acceptable to the Supreme Being by other means than that of having the moral law at heart. Page 130. Insofar as life after death is concerned, Kant argues that this, at best, is a theoretical issue which cannot be resolved, because we have no choice but to construe the thinking self as alive, page 132, which we interpret to mean that the idea of life after death is a practical contradiction. It is, of course, possible to think about someone after their death, but that has no implications for their continued existence as a person. After one's death, a corpse continues to subsist, and it may resemble the body when alive in a state of sleep, but it cannot be woken. A physical analogy might assist us to understand the role of the body in life, e.g. when a light bulb fails to function because it is permanently damaged, that is, ceases to produce light when connected to electricity. As such, it is a light bulb in name only. A light bulb's primary function is to produce light, but when the physical conditions for this function are no longer present, the bulb is no longer a medium for the production of light. Typically, in such circumstances, we discard the light bulb and think no more about it. This is a useful analogy in that light is like life, which also requires functioning material if it is to express itself in its various forms, performing certain functions through the use of its powers, e.g. in thought and thinking. Imagining oneself speaking, thinking or perceiving, after one's death violates the principles of life articulated by both Aristotle and Kant. Furthermore, one of the implications of the above Kantian account of religion is that our idea of our souls, sush, is only possible on practical grounds, and because of the ideas of reason, God, the soul, and freedom. Yet it is only the latter that proves its objective reality by its possible effect there. By this means it makes possible the connection of the other two ideas with nature, and the connection of all three to form a religion. p.149. This is a secular vision of religion, and it further suggests why the rule of law was so important for those early civilization builders like Solon and Pericles. During the Golden Age of Greece, on Kant's reading morality would be the primary focus for the law, and religion only a secondary concern. This puts into perspective the trial of Socrates, the wisest man in Athens who, together with Aristotle, was arguing for the importance of morality in the civilization-building process. Aristotle, too, we recall was accused of heresy, and there is an argument for claiming that these three ancient philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, began the secularization process that prioritized morality over religion. Kant continued this secularization process by producing a moral system that formed the basis for international law and human rights, as well as a basis for the telos of a cosmopolitan kingdom of ends 100,000 years in the future. In such a cosmopolitan world, war will no longer occur, and the spare resources will be used for relieving poverty and education of the masses. On the above view, one might, in one respect, regret the diminishing importance of mythological religion in our modern societies, but given the sordid history of the use of religion to prosecute and kill so-called heretics, perhaps the secularization of religion was the only solution to prevent those in power from persecuting their enemies. In retrospect, now we have been exposed to the vast array of gods from different civilizations. The accusation of not believing in the one particular god a particular civilization had chosen at a particular point in its history, the killing of people for such pseudo-offenses as heresy, had no real justification. Kant's secularism is, however, not the secularism we experience in our modern societies, where many people refuse to believe in the moral author of the categorical imperative, indeed refuse to believe in anything of significance. For Kant, there is an important place for the realm of the sacred. This is not an invitation of the kind we find in mythology to unite with the divine, as Campbell put the matter, page 35. So, here we are in our exile. What can we do about the mysterious transcendent X? To find, as many a mystic has, that he was one with X and then be united with it on a martyr's pyre, this was not permitted. In our religions, we can only achieve a relationship to X. Our religions, and this is a very important point, seek a relationship to God, not the experience of identity with the divine. How does OE achieve a relationship to God? Well, there are several ways of being related to this particular deity. One is the way of the Jewish tradition, another is the way of the Christian, and a third is the way of Islam. Envelopment, as it occurs in religious contexts, is an extreme response to sacred experiences, and one advantage of the Kantian relation to the divine is that it occurs via understanding the self-sufficiency and independence of the moral principles associated with the categorical imperative. The religions mentioned above have, unfortunately through their persecution of their enemies throughout their history, exhausted their credibility by using their victims for their own ends, accusing them of pseudo-offenses such as blasphemy and heresy. Socrates certainly sensed this when he defended himself against the charge of heresy by claiming that he was the midwife of philosophy, one of the children of the gods. Kant almost set the record straight, but he too was warned by his emperor not to voice his opinion upon sacred matters. Campbell virtually ignores this secular viewpoint and hails the recent arrival of Oriental religious influences such as Buddhism and Hinduism as representing an awakening of our pre-Christian hearts, page 37, whatever this is supposed to mean. He refers to the great Greek tradition, but also to the not-so-great Roman tradition, as well as Celtic and German mythology, but fails to recognize the fundamental differences between these traditions. Can there, for example, be any greater difference between the golden age of Greek civilization building in the spirit of reason and the dark age of Roman military/engineering which chose Christianity as its religion, a religion which then built a bureaucratic church around it and used the cruelest means to defend it? One candidate for the transcendental X is, of course, the self. Campbell elaborates upon this possibility by referring to Indian writings. So, in the beginning that was no beginning, there was nothing but the self. And the self at a moment that was no moment said, I, aham, ego. And as soon as it thought, I, it experienced fear. Then it reasoned, though it was not very complicated reasoning. This was the very first attempt at reasoning after all. Since there is nothing else in the world, what do I have to be afraid of? That eliminated the fear. Of course, no sooner was the fear eliminated than it had desire. I wish there were another. Well, in that state of being, a wish is as good as a fact. The self swelled and split in half, and voila, there were two. Page 38. The process of splitting continued down the line of animal forms, and the self named all the animal forms, but soon became bored with the activity, until God put the I to sleep and generated the female Eve. Campbell points to the resemblance between this narrative and that contained in Plato's Symposium, where a whole monstrous human being is divided into two to reduce its power and separated, placing the two separate parts far away from each other. In their efforts to find each other again, they built cities and civilizations. This is really a basis for the Freudian view that all civilization is a sublimation of disappointed sex. Page 39. The Symposium dialogue, however, was about eros, not sex. Freud's later theorizing was also centered around eros, a wider concept than sexual libido, but the reference to Freud is certainly relevant. Campbell continues. In the Greek world, a god is not a creator. Rather, the gods are our big brothers, and you know how it is with big brothers, you've got to be careful with them, but they really don't have the right to order you around. Still, you'd better do what they tell you, or else you'll get hurt. This is a quite different attitude from that of the biblical, Near Eastern tradition, where God creates men to be his servants, and he gives the orders. Page 39. So, in our tradition, which is not the Greek tradition, we submit to God even in the most extreme circumstances, such as those Job found himself in. No Greek would have accepted what Job was forced to accept. Yet both of these traditions form our heritage. The Greek demigod Prometheus embodies Greek defiance. Prometheus steals fire from the gods to give to man, and is punished by Zeus by being chained to a cliff face and tormented by an eagle, but Prometheus remains undaunted and expresses contempt for Zeus. Prometheus was free to determine his own fate, and this freedom surfaced again during both the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Socrates modeled himself not on Zeus, who had castrated his father, but rather on Prometheus, attempting to define the idea of justice for man. Socrates did not, however, show contempt for the Athenian justice system when it sentenced him to death unjustly. He was in many respects the new kind of hero, the hero of the examined life, freeing himself from religion and unjust tyranny. Socrates, we know, regrettably published nothing, and we only glimpse the contours of his life thanks to his pupil Plato, who himself was no doubt influenced by the thought of his teacher, but nevertheless went off in a direction Socrates may not have agreed with. Indeed, if any direction was true to the spirit of the Socratic examined life, it was either that of Aristotle's hylomorphism or Kant's critical philosophy of freedom.